For 20 years, Laura thought she was serving God. But behind the closed doors of her congregation, a so-called man of faith used spiritual power to destroy lives, starting with hers. What looked like devotion became a nightmare of control, silence, and fear. And when she finally said no, everything came crashing down. My name is Laura, and I want to share something with you that took me 20 years to find the courage to say out loud. For 2 decades of my life, I breathed, lived, and devoted every waking moment to what I believed was God's organization on earth. I was a regular pioneer, dedicating 90 hours a month to door-to-door preaching, attending every meeting, studying every publication, with the fervor of someone who truly believed she was serving the Almighty. You know that feeling when you're absolutely certain about something? When your whole identity, your entire sense of purpose revolves around a single truth that seems unshakable? That was me. At 67 years old now, I can look back and see how completely I had surrendered not just my time, but my very ability to think for myself. In our small congregation in Ohio, nothing happened without the approval of the body of elders. These men weren't just spiritual guides to us. They were treated like direct messengers from heaven itself. Their word was law, their interpretations were gospel, and questioning them was tantamount to questioning God. The morning air in our little town still carries that same crisp scent of maple leaves and fresh coffee that used to greet me during those years. I'd wake up at 5:30 every morning, brew a pot of coffee in my blue ceramic percolator, and sit at my kitchen table with the day's text, preparing my heart for another day of faithful service. My routine was as predictable as clockwork. Tuesdays and Thursdays were for field service. That's what we called our door-to-door preaching work. I'd pack my leather service bag with the latest magazines, tracts, and Bible study aids, making sure my modest skirt fell exactly to my knees and my blouse was buttoned properly to the collar. Saturday mornings meant more field service, usually starting at 9 o'clock sharp at the Kingdom Hall. Sunday was the Watchtower study, where we'd sit in neat rows, raising our hands to give predetermined answers to predetermined questions. I lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment above the local bakery on Main Street. The smell of fresh bread would drift up through the floorboards every morning at 4:30 when old Mr. Henderson started his ovens. My apartment was sparse but clean. A brown corduroy couch that had seen better days, a wooden coffee table where I spread out my study materials, and a bookshelf lined with Watchtower publications dating back to the early 80s. Laura, you're such a fine example for the younger sisters, Sister Margaret would often say to me after meetings. She was in her 70s then, a widow who had been in the truth, as we called it, for over 40 years. Her words always made me swell with pride, believing I was truly pleasing to God. But even in those early days, something would occasionally stir in the back of my mind. Little questions that I'd quickly push away, telling myself they were signs of spiritual weakness. When prophecies didn't unfold as expected, when explanations for biblical texts seemed to shift with new publications, when I'd read a scripture and think it meant something different from what the organization taught, these moments would come and go like shadows. The Kingdom Hall was a simple rectangular building with beige carpeting and rows of cushioned chairs facing a modest platform. The walls were decorated with scenes from Bible stories, Jesus with children, people of all nations in paradise, families studying together. It smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and the faint perfume of elderly sisters who had been wearing the same fragrance for decades. Brother Samuel, our presiding overseer, was a man in his 60s with silver hair that he combed straight back and thick-rimmed glasses that made his eyes look larger than they were. He spoke with the kind of authority that made you feel like you were hearing directly from God's throne. Brother Robert, the elder who would later change the course of my life, was younger, maybe in his late 40s during those years. He had a way of speaking that was both gentle and commanding, and the sisters often commented on what a spiritual man he was. The faithful and discreet slave provides food at the proper time, Brother Robert would remind us during his talks, referring to the organization's governing body. We must trust that channel of communication completely. I believed it with every fiber of my being. When I knocked on doors in our quiet neighborhood, past the white picket fences and well-maintained lawns, I genuinely thought I was offering people the most precious gift imaginable, the truth about God's kingdom. I remember the weight of my service bag on my shoulder, the sound of my modest heels clicking on concrete sidewalks, the way my heart would race when someone actually agreed to listen. Tuesday afternoons were for visiting my Bible studies. I had 3 regular students during those years. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman whose husband had recently died. David, a young man in his 20s struggling with addiction. And Sarah, a mother of 2 small children who was searching for meaning after a difficult divorce. I'd sit in their living rooms, turn to familiar scriptures, and explain how only God's kingdom could solve all human problems. The sense of purpose was intoxicating. Every morning, I'd wake up knowing exactly what my mission was, exactly how to dress, exactly what to believe about every aspect of life. The organization had answers for everything, from whom I should marry to what movies I should watch, from how to discipline children to what constitutes proper hairstyles for Christian women. But late at night, when I'd sit in my small apartment with a cup of chamomile tea, sometimes a question would surface that I couldn't quite suppress. Why did Jesus speak of his Father's house having many rooms if only Jehovah's Witnesses would survive? Why did some of the prophecies about dates seem to shift over time? Why did certain scriptures seem to contradict what we were taught? I'd shake my head and reach for another watchtower, reminding myself that questioning was a sign of pride, that humble sheep trust their shepherd. The aroma of Mr. Henderson's bread would fill my apartment, and I'd pray for forgiveness for my doubting thoughts, never realizing that what I was experiencing wasn't spiritual weakness. It was my conscience trying to wake up. Those questions were just whispers then, barely audible over the noise of my busy spiritual routine. But whispers have a way of growing louder, especially when they're connected to truth. What I didn't know was that those small doubts were the first cracks in a foundation that would eventually crumble completely, leaving me free to build something real and honest in its place. Looking back now, I can see that even then, God was preparing me for a journey I never could have imagined. A journey that would cost me everything I thought I knew about myself, but would ultimately give me something far more valuable: the freedom to think, to question, and to find my own authentic relationship with the divine. I need to tell you more about who I was during those years, and who the people around me really were beneath the surface of our carefully maintained spiritual facade. Understanding the depth of my devotion and the complex web of relationships within our congregation is crucial to comprehending how completely I was trapped, and how devastating it was when everything began to unravel. I was born Laura Elizabeth Morrison in 1957 in a small farming community outside Columbus, Ohio. My parents, Robert and Helen Morrison, were hard-working people who raised me with strong values but no particular religious affiliation. Dad worked at the local grain elevator, and Mom took in sewing to help make ends meet. Our little house on Elm Street smelled like Mom's lavender sachets and Dad's pipe tobacco, and Sunday mornings meant pancakes and listening to country music on the radio. I was 23 when the witnesses first knocked on my door. I had just married Tom, my high school sweetheart, and we were living in that same small apartment above Henderson's Bakery, where I would spend the next 2 decades. Tom worked as a mechanic at Miller's Auto Shop, coming home every evening with grease under his fingernails and stories about the cars he'd fixed. He was a good man, patient, kind, with laugh lines around his green eyes and a way of making me feel safe in the world. When Sister Margaret and Sister Ruth first studied with me, Tom was skeptical but supportive. "If it makes you happy, honey, then I'm glad for you," he'd say, though I could see the concern in his eyes as I became more and more consumed with my new faith. The transformation was gradual at first. I started attending meetings twice a week, then began participating in the door-to-door work on weekends. "Laura's making excellent progress," Brother Samuel announced during one of our midweek meetings, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest that I mistook for God's approval. By the early 80s, I had been baptized and was spending every spare moment in service to the organization. Tom watched me change from a carefree young woman who loved dancing and spontaneous weekend trips into someone who measured every action against a complex set of religious rules. The elders during those years seemed like pillars of righteousness to me. Brother Samuel had been in the truth for over 30 years, having been baptized back in the 1950s when the organization was much smaller. He had a wife, Sister Eleanor, who was the epitome of what we called a submissive Christian woman. She never spoke out of turn, always deferred to her husband's judgment, and had a way of making even criticism sound gentle and loving. "Sister Laura," she would say to me after meetings, adjusting the small pearl brooch she always wore on her navy blue dresses, "remember that a woman's greatest glory is her quiet and submissive spirit." I absorbed these teachings like a sponge. I learned to speak softer, to defer more to authority, to suppress the natural curiosity and independent thinking that had always been part of my personality. Tom noticed the changes before I did. "You used to laugh more," he told me one evening in the spring of 1983, as we sat on our small balcony watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. "You used to ask me what I thought about things. Now it seems like you already know all the answers." I remember feeling confused by his words, even a little hurt. Didn't he understand that I had found the truth? That I was becoming the woman God wanted me to be? The distance between us grew slowly, imperceptibly at first, like the way water gradually erodes stone. Brother Robert joined our congregation in the mid-'80s, transferring from a congregation downstate where he had served as an elder for several years. He was in his late 40s then, with dark hair that was just beginning to show silver at the temples and deep brown eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul. His wife, Sister Carol, was a quiet woman with graying blonde hair who always sat in the third row during meetings, taking careful notes in a small spiral notebook. "Brother Robert brings a wealth of spiritual experience to our congregation," Brother Samuel announced when introducing him. "He's conducted numerous judicial committees and has a real gift for helping spiritually weak ones return to Jehovah's path." Robert had a way of speaking that commanded attention. His voice was measured and calm, but there was an underlying intensity that made you hang on every word. During his talks from the platform, he would pace slowly, making eye contact with different members of the audience, his hands moving in precise gestures that emphasized his points. "The faithful Christian must be willing to examine every aspect of their life," he would say, his gaze sweeping across the congregation. "Nothing can be hidden from Jehovah's eyes, and nothing should be hidden from his appointed shepherds." I found his spiritual insight impressive. When he gave counsel, it was always backed up with multiple scriptures, delivered with the kind of authority that made questioning seem not just inappropriate, but spiritually dangerous. Other sisters in the congregation often commented on how blessed we were to have such a knowledgeable elder. "He really knows the Bible inside and out," Sister Margaret would whisper to me before meetings began. "You can tell he's been personally trained by some very mature brothers." What I didn't understand then was how masterfully he was reading the congregation, identifying who was most vulnerable, most eager to please, most willing to accept authority without question. I was an ideal target, a relatively new convert, highly dedicated, without strong family ties in the organization, and married to an unbelieving husband who was growing increasingly distant from my religious activities. My relationship with Tom continued to deteriorate throughout the mid-'80s. The organization taught that spiritual obligations came before everything else, including marriage to an unbeliever. I was encouraged to put kingdom interests first, even if it meant spending less time with my husband or choosing congregation activities over couple time. "A Christian wife must be patient with an unbelieving mate," Sister Eleanor counseled me during one of our informal conversations after a meeting. "But she must never compromise her relationship with Jehovah for the sake of keeping peace at home." I took this advice to heart, gradually prioritizing my spiritual activities over my marriage. When Tom suggested we spend Saturday mornings together instead of me going out in field service, I gently but firmly declined. When he wanted to plan vacation trips that would conflict with circuit assemblies or conventions, I explained that these were vital spiritual events I couldn't miss. "It's like I'm married to a stranger," he told me one night in 1986, his voice heavy with sadness rather than anger. "I know you think what you're doing is right, Laura, but you're disappearing. The woman I married is disappearing." I felt torn between two worlds, but the organization had trained me to see this conflict as a test of my faith. The discomfort I felt when Tom expressed his hurt was explained as Satan trying to use my natural affections to draw me away from God. I learned to push down my empathy, to see his pain as spiritual weakness rather than legitimate concern. Brother Robert seemed to understand my struggles in a way that others didn't. He would sometimes approach me after meetings, asking how I was handling the challenges of having an unbelieving spouse. "Sister Laura, I can see the spiritual maturity you're developing," he would say, his voice low and confidential. "Jehovah is watching how you handle these trials, and he's pleased with your faithfulness." These conversations made me feel special, chosen, spiritually mature in a way that others weren't. He had a gift for making each person feel like they were receiving unique insight, personal attention from someone who truly understood their spiritual condition. Not everyone has the spiritual strength to put kingdom interests first when it costs them personally, he would tell me, his dark eyes serious and intense. "But you do, Sister Laura. I can see that Jehovah is preparing you for greater responsibilities." I treasured these words, storing them up like precious gems. In a marriage that was becoming increasingly strained, in a life that felt more and more isolated from normal human connections, these moments of recognition felt like lifelines. I didn't recognize them for what they really were: carefully crafted manipulation designed to increase my dependence on his approval and authority. By 1987, I was serving as a regular pioneer, a designation that required 90 hours of preaching each month. I had organized my entire life around this schedule, rising early to prepare for field service, spending afternoons making return visits on interested people, and devoting evenings to study and meeting preparation. My small apartment became a staging area for kingdom activity. Magazines stacked neatly on the coffee table, service bags hanging by the door, study materials spread across every available surface. Tom and I were like ships passing in the night. He would leave for work before I woke up for morning field service, and I would return from evening meetings after he had already gone to bed. We still shared the same space, but we were living completely separate lives. "I feel like I don't even know you anymore," he said to me one morning, standing in our kitchen with his coffee mug in his hands, looking older than his 30 years. "And I don't think you know me either." The tragedy was that he was right, but I had been taught to see this as spiritual progress rather than personal loss. The organization had gradually reshaped my understanding of love, loyalty, and commitment until serving God meant abandoning everything and everyone that had once mattered to me. Looking back now, I can see how perfectly I had been groomed, not just for increased organizational devotion, but for the abuse that was coming. My independent thinking had been systematically dismantled. My natural support systems had been eroded, and my sense of self-worth had become completely dependent on approval from men who claimed to speak for God. Brother Robert was watching all of this, measuring my vulnerability, calculating when and how to make his move. I was exactly where he wanted me, isolated, dependent, and completely trusting in the spiritual authority he represented. What I thought was spiritual growth was actually preparation for something far darker than I could have imagined. The shift began so subtly that I almost missed it entirely. It was the fall of 1987, and the leaves outside my apartment window were turning the brilliant oranges and reds that had always reminded me of God's artistry. I was at the peak of my spiritual activity, pioneering faithfully, conducting 3 Bible studies, and feeling more devoted than ever. But something was changing in the undercurrents of our congregation, something that would eventually pull me into depths I never could have imagined. Brother Robert had been serving in our congregation for nearly 2 years by then, and his influence had grown considerably. Brother Samuel, our longtime presiding overseer, had begun dealing with health issues, diabetes and high blood pressure, that left him frequently exhausted. Gradually, more and more responsibilities shifted to Brother Robert, who seemed eager to take on the additional load. "Brother Robert has such a shepherd's heart," Sister Eleanor mentioned to me one Thursday morning as we prepared for field service. "Samuel says he's never worked with an elder who shows such personal interest in the flock." It was true that Robert had a way of making each person feel individually important. He remembered details about people's lives, asked follow-up questions about personal struggles, and seemed genuinely invested in everyone's spiritual progress. When Sister Margaret's arthritis was bothering her, he would personally ensure she had a ride to meetings. When young Brother David was struggling with finding work, Robert spent extra time counseling him and even helped him make connections with brothers who owned businesses. "He's not like some elders who just give talks and conduct meetings," Sister Carol, his wife, told a group of us sisters one evening after the book study. Robert really cares about people as individuals. Sometimes he's up late into the night, praying for specific members of the congregation or preparing personalized counsel for someone who's struggling. I admired this dedication immensely. In a world that often felt impersonal and cold, here was a spiritual man who seemed to embody the kind of shepherding care that Jesus had shown. When Robert began taking special interest in my spiritual progress, I felt honored rather than concerned. It started with casual conversations after meetings. He would approach me as I was gathering my things, asking thoughtful questions about my Bible studies or commenting on something insightful I had shared during the Watchtower study. "Sister Laura, your comment about Job's faithfulness really showed deep spiritual thinking," he said to me one Sunday afternoon in October. "It's refreshing to see a sister who really studies rather than just reading the paragraph." These moments of recognition felt precious to me, especially as my home life continued to deteriorate. Tom had grown increasingly resentful of my religious activities, and our conversations had become tense and infrequent. The validation I received at the Kingdom Hall was becoming my primary source of emotional support. "Your husband doesn't appreciate the spiritual treasure he has in you," Robert mentioned to me one evening after a particularly difficult week at home. "It must be challenging to maintain your spiritual focus when you're not receiving encouragement at home." His words resonated deeply with me. Finally, someone understood the sacrifices I was making, the challenges I faced in trying to serve God while married to an unbeliever. These conversations began happening more frequently, usually in quiet corners of the Kingdom Hall after others had left, or during those few minutes before meetings when people were still arriving. By November, Robert had begun suggesting that I might benefit from additional personal study. He offered to conduct a special weekly study with me, focusing on deeper biblical topics that weren't covered in the regular congregation meetings. "You have real potential for spiritual growth, Sister Laura," he explained, his voice carrying that particular tone of authority that made questioning seem inappropriate. "But to reach that potential, you need more intensive guidance than what's possible in group settings." The arrangement seemed perfectly reasonable. Many elders conducted additional studies with congregation members who showed special interest or needed extra help. We agreed to meet every Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock in one of the smaller rooms at the Kingdom Hall, after the regular book study had concluded and most people had gone home. Our first few sessions were exactly what I had expected. Detailed examination of challenging biblical topics, discussion of Hebrew and Greek word meanings, exploration of prophecies and their fulfillments. Robert was clearly knowledgeable, referencing scholarly sources and providing insights that went far beyond what was typically discussed in congregation meetings. "Most Christians never get past surface-level understanding," he told me during our third session as we studied Ezekiel's temple vision. "But God rewards those who dig deeper, who are willing to spend time really wrestling with His Word." I felt privileged to be receiving this level of personal attention from someone so spiritually mature. The studies were intellectually stimulating in a way that my regular routine had begun to lack, and I looked forward to them as highlights of my week. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the nature of our interactions began to change. Robert started asking more personal questions during our studies, wanting to know about my emotional state, my marriage difficulties, my deepest spiritual concerns. "A shepherd needs to understand the whole person," he explained when I seemed hesitant to share intimate details about my relationship with Tom. "How can I provide proper guidance if I don't understand the full scope of what you're dealing with?" His question seemed reasonable, grounded in genuine pastoral concern. He wanted to know how Tom's attitude affected my prayer life, whether I felt emotionally supported in my spiritual goals, how I handled the loneliness of being the only believer in my household. "It's clear that you're not receiving the emotional and spiritual support that a dedicated Christian woman needs," he observed after I had shared some of my struggles. "That kind of deprivation can have serious effects on a person's spiritual and emotional health." These conversations made me feel understood in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Tom had grown increasingly impatient with my religious discussions, while the other sisters in the congregation, though friendly, didn't seem to grasp the depth of my commitment or the challenges I faced at home. "You're fortunate to have a shepherd who really understands you," Robert said to me one Tuesday evening in December as snow began falling outside the Kingdom Hall windows. Not every Christian has access to this level of personal guidance and support. I agreed wholeheartedly. The personal attention felt like a gift from God, a sign that my devotion was being noticed and rewarded. When Robert suggested that our studies might be more effective if we met in a more private setting, where we wouldn't be interrupted by others using the Kingdom Hall, it seemed like a natural progression. My office at the insurance company would be perfect, he suggested. It's quiet, private, and we'd have access to my personal theological library. Plus, we could extend our sessions if we're making good progress without worrying about building schedules. His office was located in a small professional building downtown, about 15 minutes from the Kingdom Hall. It was decorated with family photos, Bible commentaries, and motivational plaques with scripture verses. Everything about it reinforced his image as a serious, dedicated Christian man. Our first meeting there, in early January of 1988, followed the same pattern as our previous sessions. We studied, discussed complex theological points, and talked about my spiritual progress. But something felt different about the environment. The intimacy of being alone together in his personal space, away from the familiar surroundings of the Kingdom Hall, created a subtle shift in dynamics that I couldn't quite identify. "You seem more relaxed here," Robert observed, and I realized he was right. Something about the setting made me feel more open, more willing to share personal thoughts and feelings that I normally kept carefully guarded. "It's nice to have a place where we can really focus," I agreed, settling into the comfortable chair across from his desk. "I feel like I can be more honest about my struggles when we don't have to worry about being overheard." This honesty, this openness, was exactly what Robert had been cultivating. As January turned to February, our conversations became increasingly personal. He wanted to know about my childhood, my relationship with my parents, my fears and insecurities, my dreams for the future. "Understanding these deeper aspects of your personality helps me provide better spiritual guidance," he explained. "God wants his servants to be whole people, not just rule followers who never examine their inner lives." I found myself sharing things with Robert that I had never told anyone. Childhood disappointments, marriage frustrations, spiritual doubts that I had always felt too ashamed to voice. He listened with what seemed like genuine compassion, offering insights that felt both spiritually profound and personally validating. "Your sensitivity and depth of feeling are gifts from God," he told me one February evening, after I had shared some particularly vulnerable thoughts about feeling misunderstood and isolated. "Not everyone has the capacity for the kind of spiritual intimacy that you're capable of experiencing." These words resonated with something deep inside me. For years, I had felt like my intense spiritual hunger was something I had to apologize for, something that made me different and perhaps excessive compared to other Christians. Robert was telling me that these very qualities were signs of special spiritual potential. "God has a unique purpose for you, Sister Laura," he continued, his voice taking on that authoritative tone that had always commanded my respect. "But fulfilling that purpose requires a level of trust and submission that most Christians aren't capable of achieving." The way he spoke about trust and submission felt different from the general organizational teachings I was familiar with. There was something more personal, more intimate about his expectations. When he began suggesting that our study sessions might be more effective if I were more physically relaxed, it seemed like a natural extension of his concern for my overall well-being. "Spiritual receptivity is connected to physical comfort," he explained, encouraging me to sit in the more comfortable chair in his office, rather than the straight-backed one I usually chose. "God designed us as integrated beings. Body, mind, and spirit all work together." These changes happened so gradually that each step seemed reasonable in isolation. When he suggested that shoulder tension might be interfering with my ability to concentrate during our studies, his offer to help me relax seemed like pastoral care rather than anything inappropriate. "Many people carry stress in their shoulders and neck," he said, moving to stand behind my chair during one of our sessions in early March. "A little massage can help clear the mind for spiritual focus." I felt uncomfortable, but didn't know how to object without seeming ungrateful for his concern or suspicious of his motives. After all, this was an elder, a man who had devoted his life to serving God and helping others. Surely his intentions were pure, and any discomfort I felt was just my own imperfect thinking. "You're very tense," he observed, his hands moving across my shoulders with practiced confidence. "This kind of physical stress can really interfere with spiritual progress. You need to learn to trust more, to let yourself be truly relaxed and receptive." The massage lasted only a few minutes, but something fundamental had shifted in our relationship. A boundary had been crossed, though so subtly that I couldn't quite identify what had happened or why it felt significant. Robert seemed completely normal afterward, transitioning seamlessly back into our Bible discussion as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Feeling better?" he asked, settling back into his chair with a satisfied smile. "I can tell you're more relaxed now. This is exactly the kind of receptive state that allows for deeper spiritual insight." I nodded, though I felt more confused than relaxed. The physical contact had felt inappropriate somehow, but I couldn't reconcile that feeling with everything I knew about Robert's character and position. Surely I was just being oversensitive, maybe even spiritually weak in my inability to receive help without suspicion. Over the following weeks, these boundary crossings became more frequent and more pronounced. Robert would find reasons to touch my hand during our discussions or stand unnecessarily close when showing me passages in books. Each incident was brief and could be explained away as accidental or pastoral, but cumulatively, they created an atmosphere of inappropriate intimacy that left me feeling increasingly uncomfortable. "You seem tense again tonight," he would say, moving to massage my shoulders without asking permission. "Remember, spiritual growth requires learning to trust completely, to surrender control, and allow yourself to be guided." His words carried layers of meaning that I was only beginning to understand. The massage sessions became longer and more invasive, with Robert explaining that my spiritual progress depended on my ability to overcome false modesty and trust his guidance completely. "God uses imperfect vessels," he told me one evening in late March, as his hands moved in ways that made me want to flee from the room. "Your discomfort is just evidence of how much spiritual work we still need to do. True submission requires overcoming these natural reactions." I felt trapped between my growing alarm and my deep-seated belief in his spiritual authority. Every instinct told me that something was wrong, but my religious training had taught me to distrust my own judgment when it conflicted with that of appointed elders. The organization had spent years teaching me that questioning shepherds was a sign of pride and spiritual immaturity. "This is how God tests his servants," Robert explained, his voice taking on that tone of absolute certainty that had always compelled my obedience. "He allows them to face situations that feel uncomfortable to their imperfect flesh, to see if they'll trust his appointed representatives or follow their own flawed reasoning." By April, I was dreading our Tuesday meetings while simultaneously feeling guilty for that dread. Robert had convinced me that my discomfort was evidence of spiritual weakness, that overcoming it was essential for my continued growth as a Christian. I felt completely alone, unable to confide in anyone without admitting to participation in something that I increasingly suspected was wrong. The isolation was overwhelming. Tom and I were barely speaking by then, and the distance between us made it impossible to seek his advice or support. The other sisters in the congregation looked up to Robert so much that any suggestion of impropriety would have seemed like slander against a faithful elder. "Who would believe you anyway?" Robert asked me one evening, as if reading my thoughts. "Everyone knows how much pressure you're under at home, how emotionally unstable an unbelieving spouse can make a Christian woman. If you tried to say anything against me, people would just assume you were having some kind of breakdown." The truth of his words hit me like a physical blow. He was right. My credibility had been systematically undermined by months of sharing my marriage problems with him. Any accusation I made would be seen through the lens of emotional instability and spiritual weakness. I was trapped, isolated, and completely dependent on the approval of the very person who was destroying me. The Laura who had once been confident and independent had been carefully dismantled, replaced by someone who questioned her own perceptions and trusted authority figures more than her own conscience. But something deep inside me, something that had been dormant for years, was beginning to stir. A small voice that whispered that God would never require this kind of submission, that true spiritual authority would never operate in darkness and secrecy. That voice was getting stronger, and Robert was beginning to notice. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. A moment when I would have to choose between the comfortable prison of unquestioning obedience and the terrifying freedom of trusting my own conscience. That moment was coming, and when it arrived, nothing would ever be the same. The moment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday evening in May 1988. Spring had arrived in Ohio with its characteristic unpredictability. Warm sunshine during the day, giving way to cool, damp evenings that carried the scent of rain and blooming lilacs. I had been dreading our weekly study sessions for weeks, but I couldn't bring myself to cancel them without a reason that wouldn't expose what had been happening. That particular evening, I arrived at Robert's office building just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. My hands were trembling as I climbed the stairs to the second floor, and I found myself praying for strength in a way that felt different from my usual prayers. Instead of asking for spiritual guidance or wisdom, I was asking for the courage to trust my own conscience. "Sister Laura, you're looking lovely tonight," Robert said as he opened his office door, his familiar smile carrying undertones that I had learned to recognize and fear. "I've been looking forward to our session. I think we're ready to make some real breakthroughs in your spiritual development." The office felt smaller than usual, the familiar surroundings now carrying an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe normally. I took my usual seat, but everything felt different. The comfortable chair that had once represented privilege and special attention now felt like a trap. "Before we begin our study tonight," Robert said, moving to lock the office door with a casual gesture that sent alarm bells ringing through my entire being, "I want to talk about trust, real trust, the kind that God requires from his most devoted servants." I watched him lock that door, and something crystallized inside me with startling clarity. This was not about spiritual growth. This was not about God's will or biblical understanding or shepherding care. This was about power, control, and exploitation dressed up in religious language. "Brother Robert," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears, "I don't think we should lock the door. People might need access to the building." He turned to face me with that patronizing smile I had seen so many times before, the one that had always made me doubt my own judgment and defer to his spiritual authority. "Sister Laura, we've talked about this kind of resistance before," he said, his tone carrying that familiar note of gentle correction that had always compelled my submission. "Your discomfort is just evidence of how much work we still need to do on developing proper trust and submission." But something had shifted fundamentally in my perspective. The words that had once carried almost hypnotic power now sounded hollow and manipulative. I could hear the calculated psychology behind them, the way they were designed to make me question my own instincts and surrender my will to his control. "This isn't about spiritual development," I said, standing up from the chair with a resolve that surprised me. "This is wrong, and I think you know it's wrong." Robert's expression changed instantly. The gentle, pastoral mask slipped away, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. For a moment, I saw him clearly for what he really was. Not a spiritual shepherd, but a predator who had carefully groomed me for months, systematically breaking down my defenses and isolating me from any source of support or validation. "You're having an emotional breakdown," he said, his voice taking on a tone of clinical assessment. "The stress of your marriage situation has finally become too much for you to handle rationally. This is exactly the kind of instability I've been trying to help you overcome." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that I could see how it had worked on me before. He was reframing my resistance as evidence of mental instability, making my very objection to his behavior proof that I needed his guidance and control. "I'm not having a breakdown," I said, moving toward the locked door. "I'm thinking clearly for the first time in months. Please unlock this door." "Sister Laura, sit down," he commanded, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that had always triggered my automatic obedience. "We need to pray about this spiritual crisis you're experiencing. Satan is clearly using your emotional instability to turn you against God's appointed shepherds." But the spell was broken. I could see the manipulation tactics that had once been invisible to me. The religious language, the claims of divine authority, the systematic undermining of my confidence and judgment, it was all suddenly transparent. "No," I said, the word feeling foreign and powerful in my mouth. I'm not going to pray with you. I'm not going to sit down. I'm going to leave, and you're going to unlock that door right now." Robert's expression hardened into something I had never seen before. The mask of spiritual concern was completely gone, replaced by naked anger and frustrated control. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Do you think anyone will believe you? Do you think anyone will take the word of an emotionally unstable woman with an unbelieving husband over that of a faithful elder with decades of service?" The threat was clear, and for a moment the old fear tried to reassert itself. He was right that my credibility had been systematically undermined. He was right that speaking out would cost me everything: my position in the congregation, my friendships, my entire social world. But as I stood there in that locked office, facing down someone who had spent months carefully destroying my sense of self-worth and independent judgment, I realized that I had already lost everything that really mattered: my integrity, my ability to trust my own conscience, my authentic relationship with God. All of it had been gradually stripped away and replaced with a hollow performance of spirituality that served his agenda rather than any divine purpose. "Maybe you're right," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "Maybe no one will believe me, but I'll know the truth, and God will know the truth, and that's enough." I moved toward the door, and Robert stepped into my path, his physical presence suddenly feeling threatening in a way that cut through all the religious rhetoric and revealed the situation for what it truly was. "Move away from the door," I said, my voice carrying a firmness I hadn't heard from myself in years. "This ends now." For a long moment we stared at each other, and I could see him calculating his options, weighing the risks of escalating the situation further. Finally, perhaps recognizing that his psychological control had been completely broken, he stepped aside and unlocked the door. "You'll regret this," he said, as I gathered my things with shaking hands. "You're throwing away your spiritual future for a moment of prideful rebellion. This will destroy you." I paused at the threshold, looking back at him one last time. The man who had seemed so spiritually mature, so wise and authoritative, now looked small and pathetic. The power he had wielded over me had been entirely dependent on my willingness to surrender my own judgment. And without that surrender, he was just a middle-aged man making threats. "No," I said quietly. "This will save me." I walked out of that office and into the cool evening air, my legs trembling with adrenaline and the overwhelming relief of finally trusting my own conscience. The parking lot looked exactly the same as when I had arrived, but everything had changed. I was no longer the same person who had climbed those stairs an hour earlier. The drive home from Robert's office that night was the longest 15 minutes of my life. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles went white, and I had to pull over twice because I was shaking too badly to drive safely. The reality of what had just happened and what it meant for my entire life was beginning to sink in with devastating clarity. I sat in my car outside Miller's auto shop where Tom worked, watching the familiar neon sign flicker in the darkness. The building looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but I felt like I was seeing it from another planet. Everything I had believed about myself, about my faith, about the organization that had been the center of my universe for over a decade, had been shattered in the space of an hour. When I finally made it back to our apartment above the bakery, Tom was sitting at our small kitchen table with a cup of coffee and an automotive magazine spread out in front of him. He looked up when I came through the door, and I saw his expression change from casual greeting to immediate concern. "Laura, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I stood in our tiny entryway, still wearing my modest meeting dress and clutching my service bag, trying to figure out how to explain something that I could barely comprehend myself. How could I tell him that everything I had sacrificed our marriage for had been built on lies and manipulation? How could I admit that I had been so completely deceived? "I need to tell you something," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "about the organization, about what's been happening." Tom set down his coffee cup and gave me his full attention, something that hadn't happened between us in months. The concerned look in his green eyes reminded me of the man I had fallen in love with in high school, before religious obligations had built walls between us. "Okay," he said gently, "I'm listening." The story came out in fragments over the next hour. I told him about the private studies with Robert, about the gradual escalation of inappropriate behavior, about the psychological manipulation that had made me doubt my own perceptions. Tom listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail I shared. "Jesus Christ, Laura," he said when I finished, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I remembered from our early years together. "This has been going on for months. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I thought it was my fault," I admitted, the words feeling like broken glass in my throat. I thought I was being spiritually weak, that my discomfort was evidence of my own imperfect thinking. They teach you to distrust your own judgment, to always defer to the elder's authority. Tom was quiet for a long moment, processing what I had told him. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the anger underneath. "This Robert guy is a predator," he said, "and the organization that's supposed to protect people enabled him by teaching you not to trust yourself." The truth of his words hit me like a physical blow. I had been so focused on my personal betrayal by Robert that I hadn't fully grasped the systematic nature of the problem. The organization's teachings about submission and obedience hadn't just failed to protect me, they had made me vulnerable to exactly this kind of abuse. "What are you going to do?" Tom asked. It was the question I had been dreading, because I knew that any action I took would have catastrophic consequences for my life as I knew it. If I reported Robert's behavior to the other elders, I would be required to prove my allegations against a man who was beloved and respected by the entire congregation. If I couldn't provide 2 witnesses to his misconduct, which was impossible given the private nature of his abuse, I would be accused of slander and likely disfellowshipped. "I don't know," I said honestly. "If I try to expose him, they'll destroy me. But if I don't, he'll just do this to someone else." Tom reached across the table and took my hand, the first intentionally affectionate gesture he had made toward me in months. "You don't have to decide tonight," he said. "But Laura, I want you to know that whatever you choose to do, I'll support you. I've been angry about the way this religion has taken over our marriage, but I never wanted you to be hurt like this." His kindness felt like water in a desert. After months of feeling isolated and alone, having someone believe me and offer support was almost overwhelming. I realized how much I had missed having a true partner, someone who was on my side regardless of religious considerations. The next few days were among the most difficult of my life. I couldn't bring myself to go to the Kingdom Hall for the Thursday night meeting, and I called in sick to avoid my regular Friday morning field service. The thought of facing Robert, of pretending everything was normal while he smiled and greeted me as if nothing had happened, made me physically ill, but my absence didn't go unnoticed. Sister Margaret called on Friday afternoon to check on me, her voice full of genuine concern. "Laura, dear, I heard you weren't feeling well. Is there anything I can do to help?" I found myself caught between wanting to confide in her and knowing that she would never believe me. Margaret had known Robert for 2 years and had only ever seen his public persona, the kind, spiritual elder who seemed to care so deeply about everyone in the congregation. "I'm just dealing with some personal issues," I told her, which was true as far as it went. "Would it help to talk to one of the elders?" she suggested. "Brother Robert has such a gift for helping people work through spiritual difficulties. I'm sure he'd make time to counsel with you." The irony was so painful that I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing or crying. The very person who had caused my crisis was being suggested as the solution to it. This was exactly the kind of system that Robert had been counting on, one where his victims would have nowhere to turn except back to him. By Sunday, my continued absence from meetings was generating more concern and attention. Brother Samuel called personally to ask if I needed a shepherding visit, and I could hear the genuine care in his aging voice. "Sister Laura, we're worried about you," he said. "It's not like you to miss meetings without explanation. Has something happened that we should know about?" I found myself at a crossroads. Samuel was a good man who had served faithfully for decades, but he was also part of a system that I now understood was fundamentally flawed. Even if he personally wanted to help me, he was constrained by organizational policies that protected elders and silenced victims. "I'm going through a difficult time," I told him. "I need some space to think and pray about some things." "Perhaps Brother Robert could arrange to study with you personally," Samuel suggested, unknowingly twisting the knife deeper. "He's mentioned that you've been making good spiritual progress in your private studies together." The comment revealed that Robert had been discussing our sessions with the other elders, probably framing them as evidence of his pastoral care and my spiritual neediness. He had been laying groundwork to discredit me long before our final confrontation. "I don't think that would be helpful right now," I managed to say. "Well, if you change your mind, just let us know. We're here to help however we can." That conversation crystallized something important for me. The system wasn't broken accidentally. It was working exactly as designed. The emphasis on submission and obedience, the requirement for multiple witnesses to prove wrongdoing, the automatic credibility given to men in positions of authority, all of it created perfect conditions for abuse while making it nearly impossible for victims to seek justice. Over the following week, I began receiving visits from concerned sisters who wanted to understand why I had suddenly stopped attending meetings. Each conversation was painful in its own way. These women genuinely cared about me, but they were operating within a framework that made it impossible for them to truly help. "Sometimes Satan attacks us when we're making the most spiritual progress," Sister Eleanor suggested during one visit, her pearl brooch catching the afternoon light as she sat on our corduroy couch. "Perhaps you're being tested because you've been growing so much spiritually." The comment was meant to be encouraging, but it revealed how completely the organization's worldview had colonized these women's thinking. Any problem, any doubt, any resistance to authority was automatically attributed to satanic influence rather than legitimate concern or institutional failure. "Have you been keeping up with your personal study?" Sister Carol, Robert's wife, asked during another visit. "Sometimes when we neglect our spiritual routine, we become vulnerable to negative thinking." I looked at this woman whose husband was a predator and realized that she probably had no idea what kind of man she was married to. Robert was skilled enough to compartmentalize his behavior, maintaining his public image while privately exploiting his position of trust. By the end of May, my decision was made. I couldn't return to the Kingdom Hall and pretend everything was normal. I couldn't participate in a system that protected abusers and silenced victims. I couldn't continue to be part of an organization that had trained me so thoroughly to distrust my own conscience and judgment. But I also couldn't expose Robert without destroying myself in the process. The deck was too thoroughly stacked against victims for me to have any hope of success. Instead, I would simply walk away, quietly and without explanation, leaving behind everything I had thought was my spiritual home. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. After 15 years of having every aspect of my life dictated by organizational policies and expectations, the prospect of complete freedom felt overwhelming. But it also felt honest in a way that nothing had for months. I was about to discover that the cost of integrity is often everything you think you can't live without, but the reward is something far more valuable: the return of your authentic self. 20 years have passed since that night in Robert's office when I finally found the courage to trust my own conscience. As I sit here in my small garden this morning, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, I can smell the coffee brewing in my kitchen and hear the morning birds beginning their daily chorus. These simple pleasures, once taken for granted, now feel like precious gifts, reminders of the authentic life I almost lost forever. The immediate aftermath of leaving the organization was every bit as devastating as I had expected it would be. Within 2 weeks of my last meeting attendance, I received a certified letter informing me that a judicial committee had been formed to address my spiritual condition. I never attended that meeting. Instead, I wrote a simple letter stating that I no longer considered myself one of Jehovah's Witnesses and asked that my name be removed from their records. The response was swift and absolute. Every person I had considered a friend for the past 15 years was instructed to treat me as if I no longer existed. Sisters who had shared meals in my home, who had prayed with me during difficult times, who had worked alongside me in field service for years, all of them walked past me on the street as if I were invisible. "It's like you died," Tom observed one afternoon as we watched Sister Margaret deliberately cross to the other side of the street to avoid encountering me outside the grocery store. "Except they're the ones who have to pretend you don't exist." He was right. The shunning policy, designed to punish those who left and pressure them to return, actually freed me from the last remaining ties to a system that had controlled and exploited me. There was a strange liberation in having the decision made final and irreversible. The first year was the hardest. I had to rebuild my entire sense of identity from the ground up, learning to make decisions based on my own moral compass rather than organizational directives. Simple choices, what to wear, what books to read, what movies to watch, required conscious thought after years of having those decisions made for me by others. Tom and I went through a period of careful reconnection, slowly rebuilding the trust and intimacy that had been eroded by years of religious interference. We started taking long walks in the evenings, talking about dreams and goals that had been set aside during my years in the organization. "I missed you," he told me one night as we sat on our small balcony, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. "I missed the woman I married, the one who asked questions and had opinions and wasn't afraid to disagree with me." We renewed our marriage vows in a small ceremony 2 years later, promising to love and support each other without the conditional clauses that had previously governed our relationship. It felt like starting over, but with the wisdom that comes from having nearly lost something precious. I never reported Robert's behavior to secular authorities. The psychological manipulation and boundary violations I had experienced, while devastating, would have been difficult to prosecute legally. But I learned later that my instincts about him had been correct. Through a network of former witnesses I connected with online, I discovered that Robert had been quietly transferred to another congregation several years after my departure, following what were described as allegations of inappropriate conduct. The pattern was depressingly familiar: institutional protection of the abuser, silencing of victims, and a system that prioritized organizational reputation over individual safety. At least 3 other women had experienced similar abuse, but the requirement for 2 witnesses and the culture of silence had prevented any meaningful accountability. The system worked exactly as designed, Dr. Sarah Martinez explained to me during one of our therapy sessions. I had started seeing her 2 years after leaving, when the psychological effects of my experiences finally caught up with me. It wasn't a failure of the system. It was the system functioning perfectly to protect those in power. Therapy helped me understand that what I had experienced wasn't just individual misconduct, but systematic psychological abuse designed to break down independent thinking and create dependency on authority figures. The organization's teachings about submission and obedience hadn't accidentally enabled Robert's behavior. They had created the perfect environment for it. I started writing about my experiences 5 years after leaving, initially just for my own healing, but eventually to help others who were going through similar struggles. My first article was published in a small newsletter for former cult members, and the response was overwhelming. Dozens of people wrote to tell me that my story had helped them understand their own experiences and find courage to trust their own perceptions. "Your words saved my life," a young woman named Jennifer wrote to me. "I was blaming myself for feeling uncomfortable with my pastor's behavior, thinking it was my own spiritual weakness. Reading your story helped me realize that my instincts were right." These connections led to speaking engagements at conferences about religious trauma, consultations with therapists who work with cult survivors, and eventually a book that detailed my experiences and the systemic problems that enable spiritual abuse. The work has been emotionally challenging but deeply meaningful. Tom and I celebrated our 40th wedding anniversary last year. We have 2 adopted children now, siblings we welcomed into our home when they were 8 and 10 years old after their parents died in a car accident. Maria is now 25 and works as a social worker, while David is 23 and teaches elementary school. They gave us the family we had always wanted, but had delayed pursuing during my years in the organization. "Mom, you taught us that real faith doesn't require you to stop thinking," Maria told me during a recent visit, as we watched her own children play in the same garden where I sit now. "That's been one of the most important lessons of my life. I attend a small Episcopal church now, drawn to their emphasis on social justice and their acceptance of questions and doubt as part of faith rather than evidence of spiritual weakness." The priest, Father Michael, is a gentleman in his 60s who encourages congregants to think critically and engage with complex theological questions. "God gave you a mind for a reason," he said during a recent sermon. "Using it isn't rebellion, it's stewardship. This morning, as I water my roses and listen to the sounds of my neighborhood waking up, I think about the woman I was 20 years ago, so certain she had found the truth, so willing to surrender her judgment to others, so afraid of asking the wrong questions. I feel compassion for her, understanding now that she was doing the best she could with the information and tools she had available. The scent of my roses mingles with the aroma of coffee and the fresh morning air, creating a sensory symphony that reminds me of how much beauty exists in ordinary moments. These simple pleasures, the freedom to question, to choose, to trust my own conscience, are the true treasures I reclaimed when I walked out of that locked office and into my authentic life. If someone reading this is struggling with similar questions about their own faith community, I want you to know that your instincts matter. Your discomfort with authoritarian control isn't spiritual weakness. It's your conscience trying to protect you. Trust that voice, even when everyone around you is telling you to silence it. This is a real story shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us with it. If you also have a story you'd like to share, write in the comments. We'd be very happy to tell your story on our channel.